Hello and welcome to India's World. I'm TRACY SHILSHI, and today we'll be talking about the significant changes that we saw last week in China. The Communist Party of China revealed its new leadership committee, breaking with tradition by not including a clear successor to President Xi Jinping. The omission cements Xi's grip on leadership for the next 5 years, and his name and teachings have been officially written into the constitution. So what kind of a China can the world, including India, be looking forward to in the coming decade, at least in the next 5 years? Our panel today is an esteemed one, of course, key analysts on the issue of China. So we've got former Foreign Secretary Mr. Shashank joining us. We have Professor Pant, Distinguished Fellow and Head of ORF Strategic Studies, and also Professor Srikanth Kondapalli from the Center of East Asian Studies at JNU. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me here. Shashank sir, if I could start with you, what, according to you, were the key takeaways that we saw from the Congress, and what, the elevation of Xi Jinping means?
One thing is clear, that China is preparing the ground for regaining its old glory and to become #1 economic power by 2050. And they have set this target, as we have discussed in some other earlier meetings, that by 2020 they will double the GDP as compared to 2010. So therefore these are things very, very clear cut. Secondly, they are making revolutionary changes in the army doctrines. And so it is not just a question of the Chinese trying to use their muscle power against their neighbors, but also they feel that they need to do something against even the most important powers in the world. And now it's no longer necessary for them to hide their capabilities. Thirdly, I think they are also going in for a new technology integration in their setups. So more research and development work will be carrying on, both on the military side as well as the civilian side, because we have seen lately that even the Americans have started complaining against hacking from China and from the Russian side.
Yes.
So Chinese now want to move well beyond that, because they normally feel that it's the Russians and the Americans who are hacking them all the time. So now they would like to set up capabilities much
Absolutely,
beyond
and they anyway called the Great Firewall of China. So, there, of course, cybersecurity is one key aspect for them as well. But Professor Harsh, in a speech, Xi Jinping calling for a new era in China. What are these structural changes that, according to you, could take place? Looking at, of course, Xi's thoughts. He's, of course, talked about socialism and things like that. But what, according to you, is going to be on the ground, the changes that we see in China?
Well, I think one of the most important aspects of what we have seen in the choreography of the last,
week,
sort of 1.5 weeks,
yes,
of the Congress has been this elevation of Xi himself to this disputed now almost emperor-like status in China, coming after Mao and Deng. So I think that somehow situates him at the core of now Chinese policy, which he was initially also, but I think the way he has centralized power will have implications for both domestic policy and foreign policy.
Yeah, if there were any questions, any criticism against him, he's obviously cut. There are no doubts. He is the supreme leader, and he's going to call the shots.
I think that the composition of the Politburo, the composition of the Standing Committee, all of that reflect a change from the previous one, which he's entitled to do in some ways. But I think he has also now, given that his thinking is now enshrined in the constitution, he has sort of somehow made himself indisputable a leader of China. And I think that with that you have seen some structural changes, like how he is going to govern the military, the civil military relations, on which he has now put his own imprimatur. So I think he is now the one who is dominating the Central Military Commission. He's the head of the Central Military Commission, of course, but the balance between the civilian and the military now has shifted primarily to the party, to Xi himself. So I think that is something very important that we'll have to take into account as we see Chinese decision making going on from now onwards. But certain other things, for example, in his thinking about environmental, the balance between man and nature that he talks about, which is new. Then I think for the larger foreign policy worldview, this idea that he is very clear and ambiguous, that China has to be at the center of the international order. So I think this gravitation towards this thought that no longer hiding and biding the time. Now we have to prove ourselves as a global power. We are now a global power, and we have to start behaving like that. And I think all of this will have enormous implications for how we as the neighbor and also other global powers look at China in the coming years.
Absolutely. Professor Kondapalli, Xi's main economic advisor and the top diplomat, they were promoted to the Politburo, and this of course shows us that these portfolios are going to get greater importance, of course, in the years to come. Mr. Shashank already pointing out the economy is, of course, going to be one of the main aspects of the next 5 to 10 years, isn't it?
Indeed, I think in terms of becoming the largest economy in the world, the Chinese have begun what is called comprehensively deepening reforms, on which Xi Jinping is also the chairman of the small leading groups on the comprehensively deepening reforms. Some 108 subjects were identified, including domestic consumption to increase instead of exports, because exports became problem because of the global financial crisis. Secondly, in terms of supply side economics, rather than on the previous investment profile. Third, they are also looking at the 12th five-year plan, 13th five-year plan on innovation in terms of the R&D expenditure and shifting from low tech to the high tech, medium to high tech. Fourth area of economic restructuring will be in terms of the manufacturing to the service sector. Manufacturing sector used to be over 56% of the GDP before. Now, last year, Li Keqiang, the premier, announced in the parliament that this has been reduced to about 40% of the GDP, which is surprising because you cannot switch on, switch off the manufacturing sector, but that's the figure that he has given in the parliament.
And especially because the Chinese economy is quite export driven, so you would imagine.
That's right. About 40 to 50% of the GDP is export-import orientation. So that's about roughly $4 to $5 trillion out of 11, 12 trillion dollars of GDP. So in other words, it's a huge task. One doesn't know how this is being carried on, but comprehensively deepening reforms is a third plenum of the 18th Party Congress in 2013 had initiated those, and it impacts on every walk of life in the economic life of China.
And you know what's interesting is, yes, economy of course going to be an interesting development that we'll be seeing in the coming years. But of course, foreign policy is also one of the key thrusts really for China. And interestingly, there haven't been very open reactions really to Xi's elevation. Compared to, let's say, when an election happens in any part of the country, this was a kind of an election in a certain way. But the reactions, of course, have been quite guarded across the world. Why is that?
Well, as far as the Asian countries are concerned, I think they really need to look at China's new profile very carefully as to how it will affect them. They must be consulting each other also to see how they can now collectively try to keep improved relations with China, but at the same time make sure that the Chinese leadership goes for cooperative kind of framework with other Asian countries. So therefore, we are seeing that India has recently had visits by Afghanistan, by the US leaders, Japanese. We have been interacting, and there is also talk about a quadrilateral where India has been slightly cautious. But at the same time, they are thinking in terms of more economic kind of a quadrilateral rather than as a strategic or military oriented one. Of course, for the military security, that of course remains very important for India, because we know that Chinese are spreading their footprint in the Indian Ocean and in the countries around India. So that, of course, India is trying to see how best they can work together with America on one hand and with Japan on the other hand, and simultaneously carrying on with their dialogue with the Chinese also. And so we will be soon hosting, I think in December, the foreign ministers from China and Russia for our trilateral talks. So I think this is how things are going on right now. So I don't see that this is the final reaction from the Asian countries. As regards the other countries, we have to see that they have their own problems also. I mean, Europe is having its Brexit issues. So British are very keen to get Chinese involved in their economy, to continue to use London as the main financial center of the world. And the Chinese are very carefully working on the NATO members and those weaker economies. So they are going to Turkey and they are going to southern European countries. So they are trying to pick up those countries which are feeling themselves under some pressure because of their own regional developments, and they want to increase their influence there. With the Americans, of course, there also we know that the Americans are requesting the Chinese to help them out on North Korea.
That's right.
And how it will work out, so that we'll have to see.
Absolutely. And taking forward, how the Asian countries have responded and for that matter, India as well. Professor Harsh, how do you see, India looking at these developments and what is it that they need to be prepared for now that they know that Xi Jinping is the leader that they'll have to deal with for a long time to come?
Yes, I think we have been in India looking at China very carefully for obvious reasons, but I think the recent spate of developments on the Sino-Indian front have made India more cautious about the future trajectory of this relationship. And in particular, I think the way the Doklam crisis happened and how it was resolved has, I think, left perhaps a very strong imprint on Indian strategic community. So I think that will also shape our response because, I mean, Xi's rise was known; it was a given. There were all people who know China would know that he was centralizing power, that he was gaining power at the expense of others, and then in the party, and that he would be the most important leader Indians will have to deal with for a long time to come.
Yes.
So I think there was some certainty about his elevation. Now I think we have to move forward with an assumption that centralization will have an impact on how China deals, with its neighbors and in particular India. So the aspect of, for example, civil-military relations. Earlier on, there was a debate in this country, also in other capitals, as to what is happening to the PLA. Perhaps PLA is becoming more aggressive.
Yes.
Now we know that PLA has been brought under some control by the civilians, by Mr. Xi himself. So I think we will have to now see how that, what sort of policy emerges out of that interaction. Also, I think this idea that now China will play the role of a global power, that gone are the days where we will hide behind the fact that we are just a developing country. That narrative has been given a decent burial. And I think now under Mr. Xi Jinping, China wants to play its role as a global power. It wants to assert itself. So if there was a very interesting contradiction in the speech, in the marathon speech that she gave. He elaborated on how China will stand up for globalization, economic globalization.
Yes.
At the same time, he was mentioning territorial disputes with a certain panache, that somehow the construction of artificial islands in South China Sea something for which China requires pat on its back. So I think that contradiction, whereby the peaceful rise narrative now comes in contradiction with this idea that China has to assert itself, will have implications for India, for its neighbors, and also for other global powers. So I think that will be an interesting development to watch out for.
All right, Professor Kondapalli, do you think so? That is something that India needs to be wary about, but it's a good sign that the PLA is perhaps going to be under a civilian leader's direct leadership, and that is a good sign in a sense, at least as far as these border tussles are concerned, at least between India and China.
Well, always the PLA is under the civilian leadership from 1927 when the Red Army was born, Red Army of the Peasants and Workers, which turned out to be the People's Liberation Army in 1940s. It has always been, they had a concept called power flows from the barrel of the gun, but the gun has to be controlled by the party.
Okay.
So it's a party army, unlike the Indian Armed Forces, which have to look at the Indian constitution rather than say Congress party or the BJP or the JDU or whatever. In the case of China, it is always the party's organ, which brought in power to the party in 1949. Having said that, I think the priorities in terms of India, number one is the reiteration of the 5-pillar foreign policy strategy, which is major power, neighboring countries, developing countries, multilateralism or multipolarity, and also soft power, which has been reiterated from the 18-party Congress, which basically means then that China is not going to recognize India as a major power. In the major power category, it will be the US, Russia, and European Union from the Chinese perspective, which is what the External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj raised this issue in February 2016 when she went to Beijing, that China needs to recognize India as a major power, which the Chinese did not, even in that meeting. Of course, it is based on ground reality anyway. So the major power concept has not been accepted for the Indian case. So India remains at the neighboring category in which it has to be dealt with. Third is, since the One Belt, One Road has been accepted as part of the party constitution as well, which suggests that we have to live with the Chinese projects in POK, Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So this will be a major thorn in the India-China relations, as the Chinese don't respect the Indian sovereignty in Kashmir. So this will remain a major point. Also, one of the reflections of the One Belt One Road will be felt in the Indian Ocean, which where we'll see a lot of contest between India and China in terms of the naval aspects. The other aspect of the foreign policy on India is the appointment of Yang Jiechi as the Politburo member.
Yes.
He had dealt with India extensively, although he was ambassador to the United States before, before he became the foreign minister. But he is the second Politburo member from the foreign ministry. First was Chiang Chi-chen in the early 1990s. And so this suggests to some kind of an elevation in terms of the foreign policy establishment. What it means for India is, since he had dealt with India extensively on the territorial disputes, in the strategic dialogues with India. Secondly, as a special representative and his talks with the Indian National Security Advisors, Mr. Ajit Doval and his predecessors. To that extent, I think the Indian establishment is familiar with Yang, and possibly if he is promoted as Vice Premier in charge of the foreign affairs, there is a certain body language that is useful for the Indian side. On the other hand, by reiterating the core interests by Xi Jinping, that he said he will not swallow, he used the word in the 19th Party Congress, which suggests that we are going to see a lot of company on our borders from China. So a Doklam kind of an incident is quite possible in future. Not necessarily in Doklam, but possibly in western sector, possibly in eastern sector.
All right. Another big, assumption that was, of course, after this CPC, after the Congress, was, that China is now going to be a major global, not a player, but a leader, in fact, in the coming years. How do you see that? Do you see that actually happening in the near future?
But that had already started with the elevation of President Trump in the United States and his America First policy.
Yes.
So China thought that that was the right opportunity for the Chinese to continue to plead for globalization, as the Western countries are under some pressure to take care of their own interests, and protectionist tendencies and somewhat fear of migrants is growing in those regions. So I think Chinese have got that leadership, but then how do they actually work out? It is only on the basis of the BRI initiative. That means that the loans will be given, money will be given to various countries liberally, but under onerous terms. So actually the Chinese will be converting all their debt into equity participation in their lands and will be owners of their lands for future. So some countries may welcome it because they themselves perhaps may not be that much responsive to their own popular opinions, and they are kind of impositions on their countries. I mean, I have Pakistan in mind, where the military generals, they control the country and they don't mind having partnerships with left or right or anywhere, so long as they can continue to remain in power, and they call the shots on their neighboring countries' policy and continue to get money. So I think this is one issue which will arise there, that the globalization will continue to remain very important for the Chinese. And as I said earlier, on science and technology, they will give great importance because they know that the communication technology is changing so rapidly, and on cyberspace, both on the scientific side as well as military side, many new developments are taking place. So the challenge for countries like India would be that so far we have tied up our software services with the West. Now, are we trying to look for something which will be India-oriented, India-centered, and then taking into account fears from our own neighboring countries? Second would be that in India we have seen, and I live in Uttarakhand for a major part of the year, that there is a question of people moving away from the border areas, what they call palayan. So what happens that if you don't have economic activities there, and I saw today's papers, even she is bothered about the shepherds moving away from the border areas, and they say, no, please go and stay there. Keep your houses there, keep your economy going.
Do not abandon that area.
Don't abandon the area. In our case, people have already abandoned many areas. So these remain challenges for us as
most of the border areas, in fact, remain, I mean, very scantily populated, of course. But how important is it, Professor Harsh, for China to continue to maintain this economy of theirs in order to remain a major global player or a major global leader, now it's being called. Because, you know, as far as the other aspects go, yes, they are, of course, quite serious on climate change, which is a void which it has, you know, comfortably eased into after, you know, US President Donald Trump, of course, talked against it. But apart from that, you know, when it comes to human rights, when it comes to even for the very fact that it's a communist setup, you know, to be a global leader, you are seen as, you know, mostly it's a democracy that is seen as a global leader, especially with the US. You know, how do you see that economy is going to be the main thrust then? It has to do really well for China to maintain its power of position.
See, it's hard power that has economic and military power that has made China what it is today in the sense in the sense of its ability to project power. It is not softer elements of power that China has any great capacity at this point.
Yes.
And I think that is where the problem, for example, for a country like China lies, that here is a communist country, communist state, which is trying to emerge a leader which talks of democracy in the international context when it doesn't have democratic institutions domestically. And I think that is what has been very interesting to watch, in the sense, if you go back to the January speech of Xi Jinping at Davos, where he said, all right, I'm going to be this guarantor of globalization. China will be the guarantor of globalization. If America decides to move away from it, we will step in and save globalization. I think it was as much, he was talking this as much about the rest of the world as he was talking about China itself, because China relies on the forces of globalization for its economic prosperity.
Yes.
So it would be very foolish of China to sort of change that. But it is also interesting that when it comes to other rules of the game, other norms, whether it's maritime, trade or human rights, as you mentioned, China has flouted them, and China does not believe in many of those norms. And this is a perennial question that international relations has faced. When powers rise, they change international norms also. So I think at some in China will be discussing how they can shift the normative discourse to those areas which benefits China, which is going to be extremely difficult because the world has changed. It is not the world of the 18th and 19th century.
Yes.
So I think that is the very complex question that China will grapple with as it continues to rise in the global hierarchy, and in particular now, when they have declared their intention to be a global power, global leader, and assert themselves globally. I think for Chinese policymakers, this question will be front and center.
Okay.
How do you convince others to follow you?
Absolutely.
You can use tools as I think earlier was mentioned. You can use economic resources and other coercive measures. But I think fundamentally, can you make others follow you without coercion? And I don't think China has found an answer to that as of yet.
All right, all right. Professor Kondapalli, very quickly then, what do you see are the challenges that are going to be for Xi at the moment? You know, economy, of course, is one thing that he's going to focus on. What other challenges do you think domestically is going to put a lot of pressure on him to act, you know, as a global leader?
Domestically, there are several problems that he has to tackle with. One is the
Gini
coefficient, which is increasing substantially. It's something like 0.56, which is the income inequalities between rural and urban areas. So as a result, we have seen 30% increase in nearly 220,000 protests.
Okay.
After Egypt and India, China is the largest in terms of the number of protests. Public protests. So it questions the Communist Party legitimacy in the longer run.
Yes.
So that's the reason why the anti-corruption drive has been initiated. We have to see, of course, that has drifted more towards the factional targets rather than to the institutional targets in the anti-corruption drive. So that's the second challenge after the Gini coefficient. There are so many other domestic, for every 1% decrease in the growth rates, there are 20 million jobless in China, and they have reduced from 10.8% to 6.2%. So there is a 4% decline in the growth rates in the last 7 years. So that has resulted in more than 100 million people jobless. So those are some challenges. In terms of the global, obviously, if the strategy is till 2050 to be at the center stage, center stage is what the slogan of the 19th Party Congress. It obviously means tensions with the other countries. First, number one, United States, number two, Russia, also with Japan, India and other countries. So they need to readjust their policies. If they want to be a hegemon, obviously the current hegemons will obviously contest them.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, it's not for nothing that you say with great power comes great responsibility. He's taken on this big position, of course, and it's most probably going to go beyond 2022 is what the indications are. So definitely there's a lot more challenges, of course. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me. I'm sorry, that's about the time that we have here in India as well. We'll join you again next week with another topic, but that's it for the moment. Thank you.